The core reason that Gorbachev failed as a leader is that Gorbachev's heart, I think, wasn't in communism or Marxism-Leninism by the time that he became general secretary. Without, while publicly he would frequently defend his Marxist credentials and at least win the tacit support of communist hardliners during fiery speeches and in public statements, he said that in retrospective, as I said before, that from Chernobyl on he had lost faith in the Soviet system and became a social democrat. Defining Gorbachev's ideological development by certain time periods, it's something that we can't really do. And the reality is that after the Soviet Union collapsed, he's going to have 20/20 hindsight to try and cover up for his mistakes. I think it's better to say that he simply did not have his heart in communism, and he did not have his heart in the global Soviet enterprise, the global communist enterprise. Gorbachev's heart moved away from communism into globalism. Leninist doctrine holds that the conflict between the socialist and capitalist states is predestined by historical materialism, and it's something that ought to be desired. This includes acceptance, not reluctance, in engaging in armed conflict with capitalist powers, along with having a vast military buildup. The Soviet Union had just committed a vast amount of its economy to this buildup and the inevitable war with the capitalist powers. To some extent, it had grown dependent upon arms shipments abroad economically. So there was this feedback mechanism which was feeding into the Cold War tensions, which was positive for the Soviet economy. The occupation and economic support given to the nations of the Warsaw Pact, on the other hand, that's not really positive for the Soviet Union. While the Warsaw Pact nations provided the Soviet Union with the ability to protect its military power, project its military power across Europe and the entire world more readily than if it was contained in its own borders, that was an advantage. But the problem for the Soviet Union was that it was this unpopular occupying power over these countries which had a very similar culture to them. And if there was any revolts that were successful in Eastern Europe, that could lead to blowback within the Soviet Union due to cultural proximity between the Soviet Union and the Eastern European states. The necessity of preventing this blowback was something that was realized with Brezhnev, and that's why the Brezhnev Doctrine happened, where they made it the official state policy to prevent any communist state from backsliding into capitalism or moving towards a form of socialism which was at odds with Moscow's form of socialism. Notice Yugoslavia and the breakaway of Tito from Stalin. His form of socialism wasn't very acceptable to the Soviet Union, and his independence wasn't either there. And so the socialism without a human face in Czechoslovakia in '68, that's not acceptable either. Preventing this meant that the Soviet Union was willing to use military force to put down any movement away from their ideology. We saw this in 53, 56, 68, and then finally in 79 with Afghanistan. The first three interventions in Eastern Europe, they cost the Soviet Union legitimacy, but they kept the Soviet Union going. When it came to the war in Afghanistan, that, on the other hand, was a fiasco. To begin with, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan was not a creation of the Soviet Union after the Second World War. It was a product of the coup that occurred there on April 27th, 28th, where elements of the Afghan Soviet Party and the military overthrew a previous military dictatorship. It was then named the Sour Revolution, and for the month that it occurred in the traditional Afghan calendar. Afghanistan had already been an unstable state before this coup, with the earlier 1973 coup that led to a military government which overthrew the monarchy in that country. The country was extremely unstable, and the military government was divided between these competing factions, and so there was all these coup attempts between that initial coup in 73 and the one that allowed the communists to come to power. The overwhelming consensus in retrospective with the one where the communists came to power, the Sour Revolution, was that it occurred without Soviet support or foreknowledge. Although it should be noted that the communists acted in the belief that they would be able to solidify their power once they took power in a coup, because they would get the backing of the Soviet Union, because they would move into the communist camp. This is something that you kind of see over and over again with the Third World. A lot of the people in the Third World that became communist, they were not that ideologically committed to communism. They just knew that they would be able to get some pretty broad support from the Soviet Union if they tilted that way. Once in power, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan proved both incredibly unstable, with violent internal infighting, and incredibly unpopular due to its aggressive secular, socialist, and feminist policies. Pushback against these policies occurred pretty fast, and by March 1979, there was widespread revolts going across the country against this communist government. Soviet leadership, despite being at an arm's length with the country before all this, decided that they had to adhere to the Brezhnev doctrine and prop up this failing government. They ultimately chose to assassinate the general secretary of the country, Havluza Amin, in the process, who had only taken power since September following this intense factional fighting, and the Soviets were able, through covert means, to put in their stooge, Babrak Karmel, in his place. As with previous interventions, the opposition to the new Soviet-installed government was crushed, and as soon as that rebellion occurred, then the Soviets felt there was this need for intervention in Afghanistan. They made a bad situation worse by intervening to prop up their own person, and when he was falling out of favor, they made it worse, the situation even worse, by intervening. They would move their troops into the country in the December of 1979, and so they were able to quickly gain control of Kabul and the other major cities in the country. But Afghanistan is a very rural, mountainous, and internally divided country. The best possible environment for a successful guerrilla resistance movement. The Mujahideen resistance fighters, who were often Islamists, that rose up in opposition to the Soviet Union and its kind of puppet government with the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, they're going to get international support from Pakistan, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and other nations. And so they are aided by this vast amount of financial resources, and Pakistan and Afghanistan share this massive border, and Soviet Union's not going to attack Pakistan directly, so Pakistan can kind of act as this base from where the Mujahideen can have strategic depth in order to organize their forces. The Soviets had no clear exit strategy in this war. I mean, their idea was that they had to intervene, that they would just put a new communist into the place. They would get rid of the old, the protesters and the people that were unloyal to communism, like they did in Czechoslovakia or East Germany or in Hungary. But the reality of the situation was there was no entrenched communists there. It was just like this palace economy that decided to become communist for Soviet support. So the war dragged on without any clear strategy or direction, and the Soviet Union went through 4 separate general secretaries over the course of 4 years. To Gorbachev's credit, he recognized that the war was unwinnable and began withdrawing forces following his summation in power after the Rust affair. The Soviets formally withdrew out of the country on the final day that they were there being February 15th, 1989. The war then continued with the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan becoming this Islamic socialist state instead of a Leninist one, but the state still received Soviet support. The war actually ended, though, with the collapse of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan in April of 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in December of 91. While the Soviet Union had no real chance of seeing the war in Afghanistan leading to a reasonable victory, leaving the conflict did have blowback, which made the country and the leadership look weak. And the withdrawal took place along with Gorbachev's massive cutback in military spending and the end of the occupation of the Warsaw Pact nations in Mongolia, the cutback of support for communist movements worldwide and their allies abroad, furthering the perception that the Soviet government was weak. Likewise, following the glasnost, the war and some popularity would eat into support for the Soviet government in general. We got to remember that losing a war isn't something that helps with national pride or national identity. Losing a war tends to weaken people's support for the state and their patriotism for it. The pullback of Soviet forces from Eastern Europe would prove to be of far greater psychological impact. I mean, I'm just hammering this home over and over again. I think that other than Gorbachev's internal weakness, and especially when he's put against the gun, he becomes pretty cowardly. But I think that there's this long-standing weakness with the Soviet Union of these Eastern European states, and that's what I'm hammering home over and over again. They're just this catch-22 that they're stuck with. I think that somebody who was more competent than Gorbachev could have solved this better, or could have tried to transition them over the course of decades away from the Soviet Union. But the reality is that they're going to withdraw from them all at once in 1989. They're going to withdraw from East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria. And they're just going to allow them to peacefully, instantaneously become liberal democracies. They're not going to try some kind of like step-by-step thing where they become socialism with a human face or anything like that, or even widespread goulash communism. They're just going to allow them to just flip back over into America's camp without a shot being fired, without any real pushback at all. I'm not even saying it has to be violent. Gorbachev could have found ways to drag his feet and just make it this slow process that could go further and further into the 90s. But he just let it happen overnight. Albania collapsed as well. They weren't a Soviet ally at that point. Romania was largely independent of the Soviet Union under Ceausescu by that point, but they were still Soviet allies, so there was no Soviet contingent there, and that they're independent, but they were Soviet allies, and they did collapse with the rest of the Eastern Bloc states in 1989. When they transitioned towards liberalism, there was the communist leadership in those countries just gave in. It was either they outright collaborated or there was tacit approval on their part. And this kind of shows that there wasn't that many true believers left. And the only people that were true believers, they fled the country fearing human rights tribunes, criminal trials, prison sentences, possible execution, ultimately in the case of Ceausescu. That kind of sped up or greased up the change, because the hierarchy within those communist states, when they saw that the Soviet Union wasn't going to back them up anymore, they saw that if they just joined in with the transition, then they could undermine what was seen as their culpability in the crimes of the previous regime. As we all know, and as I've alluded to, Romania's leadership, they didn't go down without a fight. And so there was this violent uprising, kind of like more or less like a riot that develops after a speech of Ceausescu turns south in December of '89. And so this mass riot erupts. Ceausescu and the Romanian communist leadership tries to send out the military, and then the military ends up joining with these kind of like protesters, rioters, and all that's left to protect Ceausescu is personal guard, which do remain loyal. There's infighting between the I guess the kind of like the royal guard, or the United States' like secret service kind of thing, and they go into infighting with the military, but it quickly gets resolved. Ceausescu gets captured and then put on trial in a matter of hours, a kangaroo trial, and he and his wife are executed the same day on Christmas, I believe, 1989. And this all occurs on live television. So I think that kind of sent shockwaves into the Soviet leadership, and it caused them to fear what was going on. And I think that there was this realization that what Gorbachev was doing could result in their own deaths and was very dangerous. And the Soviet Union by the beginning of 1990 wasn't out. You got to remember that Eastern European Warsaw Pact communism collapsed in '89, but the Soviet Union itself continued until 1991. But there's also another thing that's going to happen with Eastern European communist states, which is a pretty bad forewarning for the future of the Soviet Union. And that is the collapse of Yugoslavia. The collapse of Yugoslavia, I guess until the Ukraine-Russia war now, that was made everything else in Eastern Europe look like a walk in the park. And the Soviet Union, they ought to look on to this collapse as something to be feared and something to be avoided, because, you know, with Romania and Bulgaria and Hungary and East Germany and Poland and so on, Czechoslovakia, all those states, sure, there's minorities there, but they're largely homogeneous nation states. Yugoslavia, like the Soviet Union, it's a mixed, multi-ethnic society, and what held both Yugoslavia together and the Soviet Union together, that's the Communist Party. So in some sense, you got to view the Soviet Union as just this giant Yugoslavia with nukes. So if what Gorbachev is doing has led to this collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, and the most multi-ethnic communist country, which is the most internally communist, keep in mind that they were independent of the Soviet Union throughout the entire Cold War, basically, and that they had their own indigenous, self-popular form of communism. There's this concern of the leadership being killed and put on trial, the execution of Ceausescu in Romania, and then outside of your own interest as a leader or your own interest as the nomenklatura, there's just the reality of the bloodshed that's occurring with the wars in Yugoslavia, the Serbs trying to get independent of Croatia, the Croatians trying to get independent from Yugoslavia, the Serbs trying to get independent from Bosnia, and the Bosnians trying to get independent of Serbia, and the whole Kosovo thing, and everything that's going on. So allowing the Eastern European communist states to collapse, it just made the Soviet Union and its leadership look weak, not just from the outside, but most definitely from the inside. So they're going to pull back their military, not just from a sinkhole like Afghanistan, but at the same time they're pulling back their military from, while financially costly and, like I said, kind of this Achilles heel, Eastern Europe isn't in this kind of like crisis. It's not at war. And they're doing this all at once. It's like just this perfect storm of showing weakness to the world and internally. And you gotta remember that this withdrawal from Eastern Europe, like I said, maybe it could have been salami tactic. If they want to abandon this Achilles heel, maybe they could have salami tacted it. But the sense that Eastern Europe was, on the verge of breaking away from the Soviet Union at any point, that's just neocon propaganda. The peak of, in Poland, the peak of Solidarity's influence was 1980, 1981. And then it was put down by internal martial law. Poland wasn't on the verge of revolution. East Germany, Czechoslovakia, none of these countries are on the verge of revolution. Gorbachev just wholesale decided to abandon them overnight. And the result is that he's making the Soviet Union into the ultimate paper tiger. And the unrest against the communist regimes, it's going to spread into his own country, and especially into the Baltic republics. Gorbachev unilaterally pulls back from East Germany, something which even the United States, the United Kingdom, and France did not want him to do. They wanted Soviet troops to be stationed indefinitely in East Germany because they didn't want a reunited Germany to appear. West Germany, by that point, was already the biggest economy in Western Europe, in Europe in general, in a sense, because it's really hard to qualify such a autarkic and centrally planned economy as the Soviet Union on the same level as the United Kingdom or France or Spain or Italy. But the United Kingdom and France, they really, really didn't want a unified Italy or Germany because they thought that Germany, and as we know, this is what would happen, would dominate the newly emerging European market. But Gorbachev was more eager to pull back his troops than what the Western powers wanted him to do. He kind of just pulled them back and left them without any real promises or concessions. Putin always complains about NATO saying that they're not going to expand expand eastwards after the unification of Germany, and if they expand eastwards, it's going to be this threat to Russia and all this stuff. But Gorbachev didn't make any kind of formal written down arrangements with Bush or with Thatcher or with Helmut Kohl, or Mitterrand. He handshake deals it. He doesn't even take economic concessions or be like, East Germany has to, we have to have this slow process, even some kind of compromise where East Germany is going to reunify with West Germany by 2000, that they're going to maybe set some kind of referendum years in the future. No, he doesn't do anything. He just takes his 600,000 troops, gets no concession, no real formal concessions from the West, and the West doesn't even want this, at least the European West. America is not going to be as concerned about a unified Germany. But Thatcher and Mitterrand, they really do not want a unified Germany. And Gorbachev just handshake deals, don't move NATO eastward. No real formal written down deal. Takes his 600,000 troops in East Germany and just goes back with him to the Soviet Union and just shrinks his military down, and he doesn't have any housing for them or their families, and he leaves his enlisted men destitute. I think that if anything has taught us, in the United States and through history, you got to take care of veterans. Gorbachev, he's not too, up on taking care of his veterans. And so doing this and causing this housing crisis by dumping 600,000 unemployed troops back into the Soviet Union, it's not going to help you be popular when you're already making the government unpopular, already destroyed your economy, and you're opening yourself up for criticism, and now you're being pinned on the entire history of every maltreatment of the entire Soviet era. And this housing crisis and all these enlisted men being dumped back from Afghanistan and being dumped back from Eastern Europe, it's going to reveal, I'm going to mispronounce it, but it reveals Dudova Sakva. And so Dudova Sakva, it's this culture of extreme hazing which had developed in the Soviet military in the 1960s and continues onward in the Russian military to some extent to this day. And the reasoning for this is because the Soviet Union had this 2-year conscript cycle. And so what happens is that you have a junior, first year, kind of like freshman conscripts, and then you have a senior, second year conscripts. And so it leads into this really bad natural culture of hazing. And so another thing that the Soviet because tie my tongue for a second, but another thing that the Soviet Union doesn't do that Western Europe did when it advanced its militaries is that the Soviet Union doesn't have as many NCOs. It has a very minimal use of NCOs. So what you're doing is that all these senior servicemen, they're going to be given these second-year servicemen over these first-year servicemen. They're going to get these positions of power that you'd give to NCOs like sergeants, power over these enlisted men in the Western military. You're giving these men that are and they're going to be in it for years and years and decades and eventually get a pension. But with this 2-year conscript system, you're giving power and little oversight to these second-year men to kind of be over the top of the first-year men, and this leads to this really horrible culture of hazing. And so it just kind of cycles through. There's nothing to break it because it's just this constant 2-year cycle. The first year gets hazed, the second year enters their second year, and then hazes the new first year, and it just continues indefinitely. This would be a widespread scandal, which is now able to spread throughout the country due to glasnost. So these scandals are greatly going to denigrate the public's trust in the military and conscription in the Soviet armed forces. And so as soon as the hazing is brought to light, you have this rampant amount of draft dodging which is occurring, and the military is just hemorrhaging men. Because parents, they don't want to subject their children to the hazing. And this is this other common thing that you'll see throughout the world. The federal or central government's most popular institution is almost always the military, and it's the one that has the most public trust. So the Soviet Union is losing public trust in its military. That's not good. Despite the obvious examples of mass unpopularity across Europe and the apparent reality that if communist parties allow free elections, they're going to be overwhelmingly defeated, Gorbachev is going to pursue transition of the Soviet Union full speed into liberal democracy, or at least a partial democracy. And so this final movement of reform, the final kind of nail in the coffin, is Democratization, or democratization. And this engineers a final death spiral of the Soviet Union. Democratization is defined, in this case, as a radical restructuring of the central government to resemble a liberal democracy. They're going to have a new legislative body which is created, which is popularly elected instead of, you kind of earn your way into it. And this new legislature is the Congress of People's Deputies. And the Soviet Union had been a state which constitutionally before only had a single branch of government, the unilateral Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. They only have one. It's just a legislature. The Supreme, the unicameral. Sorry, that's the right word. Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. And the General Secretary, he just kind of acts executively as the executive of that legislature. And then he appoints his cabinet. Well, the Gorbachev reforms then gut that earlier Supreme Soviet and alienate its members. And he starts on this process of alienating the Communist Party and the traditional way that everything is set up, structurally speaking. The country would also become a presidential republic. They're going to move away from this whole the head of the Communist Party, the General Secretary, is who runs everything, into having a formal presidency. And Gorbachev doesn't have any election to it, right? He just becomes the president. And so he shifts over without any legitimacy from being General Secretary to being president. So at the same time, he's putting up all the members of the Communist Party that got their positions within it, within the legislature. He's making them run for office. He doesn't have to run for office himself. He just gifts himself the presidency. And so you have this other problem here with his shifting towards liberal democracy. There's no doubt that I think that Gorbachev, he was planning on transitioning the country to a fully fledged liberal democracy eventually, and that this was some kind of stopgap measure. Now, I talked about how perhaps they should have, taken bit by bit the economy and moved it towards a market economy, or made all these stopgaps with leaving Eastern Europe, right? Maybe they should have set a hard referendum or something like that for East Germany getting to West Germany or something like that, or like withdrawing the troops over a course of years instead of weeks. But when you're talking about reforming a government and making a new constitution, that's something you have to make then and there and just go with it. You can't piecemeal a constitution, because a constitution, that's your outline for the country and the government. You can't renege on it and then renege on it again. You have to be fully firm with what you're doing. And so with Gorbachev being half in and half out and then wanting to move later into a full liberal democracy, well, that's really bad. That makes it so that the populace is seeing you as withholding it. Your compromised position here seems to be like some backwards way of you retaining power. And you're not helping it by just parachuting yourself into the presidency that you just created. And like I said before, you're alienating your previous base by making them liable as never before to real elections, while you yourself are not liable to these real elections. And whenever you do a halfway measure, when you're trying to be a reformer and the majority wants a full measure, you're seen as withholding the full reform, even if you're the person pushing for that reform. Democrats in America, they see Obamacare, the real ones, they see Obamacare as this piecemeal, compromise, weak thing. And so liberals in the Soviet Union, those that want a true democracy, they see Gorbachev's new government system as this piecemeal, half-hearted thing, and that Gorbachev is the person that's blocking true democracy from taking root in the country. By putting his new legislature, which isn't just a communist body organ, it's meant to be a real legislature that's supposed to work with his new presidency together, something akin to a actual, liberal democracy constitution, by putting them up to popular vote, what ends up happening is that he's still doing this half measure, where it's a single party state, where there's the Communist Party is the only legal party. Well, what ends up happening is that all these people, they can't form their own party, but what they can do is that they can run as independents. You can either be a member of the Communist Party, or you can be not a member of the Communist Party. Likewise, the Communist Party is top-down, determining who's going to be the candidates. They're kind of picking candidates to be, they're not based on charisma, but based on backroom deals, party politics. And so they create this kind of primary system, like akin to an American primary system, within their single party state. And so you have all these independents who are charismatic. And so what ends up happening is that all these hand-picked, parachuted Communist Party members are going to be all lose. Many of them are going to lose to all these new independent, charismatic politicians that aren't hand-picked in these open elections that are either hand-picked Communist Party members or independent, just independent people that decide to run. And so Gorbachev, he's really opening up to this widespread criticism, both from the ideologically committed communists and committed reformers. He's neutral to Steel Zinn's stuff. He's neutral on a moving train. And it's transparently obvious Gorbachev's not a real communist to the communists, but to the general public, he seems like a hypocrite who is trying to, it's like a little kid that's like, I'm going to clean my room, and he shoves everything down beneath his bed and doesn't enact any real change. So he's making himself to the general public and the true reformers that want democracy, even though he wants democracy himself, into a kind of dictatorship. And these reforms, they're just window dressing. They're just shoving it under your bed and saying that everything is fine and not changing anything. So there is nobody that's going to like him at this point. Every segment of the economy, the military, the civil structure, the legislature, everything is getting screwed up by his ideas. There's nothing he's doing that's positive. And now nobody likes him at all, and he has no supporters. And these semi-free elections, they're not just for the central government of the Soviet Union. They're for the 15 constituent republics of the country in their own independent legislatures. And you got to remember that the Soviet Union, you have this de jure written constitution, and you have this de facto government, the de jure government of the constitution of the official posts, and you have the de facto Communist Party. So if you return to the real constitution, you undermine the Communist Party, the Soviet Union, as on paper, is not a federation. It is a very loose confederation. And that you have 15 autonomous republics, which are countries that are only there based on their own agreement, in paper at least, outside of the Communist Party, that they want to be there. There's nothing constitutionally to prevent, Lithuania, Georgia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and of course, Russia itself from leaving this confederation. And this is getting dicey because you got to remember that Yugoslavia just had a full-scale meltdown along ethnic lines. Russia could have a full-scale meltdown along ethnic lines, according to these 15 countries that have nothing to hold themselves together other than the Central Communist Party. And so within all these constituent republics, they're going to be open up to independent people running on their own and getting elected. They're going to be elected, and those people, just like in Yugoslavia, are going to turn out to be nationalists. And their route to popularity is populist by pushing back against the center. And you have one particularly important example. On June 12, 1991, Boris Yeltsin was elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. Russia, the country, outright. Yeltsin had run as an independent. Yeltsin had run winning over 58% in a very crowded field. And much can be said about Yeltsin as a man. He suffered from severe depression and alcoholism. He had suicide attempts and would self-harm himself. He was an absentee president after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early era of the Russian Federation, and he was consumed during this period by depression and alcoholism, and his leadership definitely helped Russia's transition and made it worse. All this being said, though, I gotta tell you guys the truth. The reality of Yeltsin is that he is an Hegelian world spirit, and he was filled with incredible courage and fortitude. And while he may have been an incredibly divisive leader, even more than somebody like Stalin, he was an incredibly decisive man. He had balls of fucking steel. And he is the wrecking ball of steel that's going to destroy the Soviet Union. Before becoming president of the Soviet Russian Republic, Yeltsin had been in construction. He served as a middle-level Communist Party bureaucrat. He was the first secretary of, I'm going to mispronounce this, Sverdlovsk Oblast. He was the first secretary of Gorkom, the Gorkom of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He was chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian SR, and he is a member of the Congress of People's Deputies of Russia. Anyway, Yeltsin had become a member of the Politburo and then was demoted by Gorbachev after he attempted suicide following a public spat with Gorbachev when he wanted more radical reform. Famously, in 1989, he went to the United States and had a near mental breakdown when he first saw a grocery store. And this is real. This is something that actually happened. Yeltsin seeing a grocery store radicalized him. While Gorbachev had publicly humiliated Yeltsin by expelling him from the Politburo, he created this grudge in Yeltsin. As the Soviet Union began to enter into this terminal decline, Gorbachev became ever so increasingly less popular, and Yeltsin became ever increasingly more popular as an opposition figure within Russia outright. He was the person that was becoming the focus, the true reformer. He's the linchpin, the embodiment of real reform. While Gorbachev, he's turning into the embodiment of the pushback against the reform, despite his own personal beliefs and what he's done so far. Gorbachev backed Yeltsin's opponents in the election, and then Yeltsin became overwhelmingly victorious, and Yeltsin knew that. It's just contributing more and more to this personal grudge that they have between each other. And you know what? The reality is, Gorbachev could have exiled Yeltsin. Gorbachev could have killed him. He could have done all these things before the August coup happened. He knew that Yeltsin was his primary opponent. He knew that Yeltsin was dangerous. But Gorbachev did not have the backbone to go through with saving the country. And that's the danger that you're going to see. Gorbachev believed in keeping Yeltsin as an opponent rather than using any means at his disposal in eradicating his opponents as you would in an authoritarian regime. And, you know, the point for democracy or any kind of liberal structure in Russia is really past, because even if Russia had been a liberal democracy, the level of emergency that was occurring in 1991 was off the charts. Everything was going wrong, and the country was sleepwalking itself into a severe famine and civil war. As the Soviet Union began to tear at the seams, the military was beginning to intervene to break up protest and try and keep the country together. And so you have these massacres which are going on by the Soviet government. And Gorbachev, the massacres of these civilians rested on his shoulders. And Gorbachev, he's directly ordering them. So Gorbachev's ordering these massacres of protesters like Deng Xiaoping in Tiananmen Square. And Gorbachev could, he could gun down Yeltsin if he wanted to, but he doesn't. And what's even worse is Gorbachev, he doesn't stick by his violence. He doesn't own up to his violence. He throws his violence under the bus and he blames it on somebody else. Something that is not going to win him favors in the military, which he just cut back on and dumped without any concessions hundreds of thousands of troops back into the country and made them look like complete idiots and fools, and made the Soviet Union into an incredibly weak-looking country from the outside. So the Soviet Union, anyway, let's talk about the first of these massacres. On December 16th to 19th in 1986, thousands of Kazakhs gathered to protest the dismissal of the ethnic Kazakh Dinmuka Hamed Kanev, I have no idea how to pronounce that, from office in Kazakhstan as the first secretary of the Communist Party of Kazakhstan. And he put the ethnic Russian Gennady Koblin into power, and that guy was parachuted in and had no connection to Kazakhstan. The military police were dispatched there to break up the uprising, and they ended up killing hundreds. In retrospect, these events would become known as the Jeloskwan, or the December Uprising, and it became pretty important in modern Kazakh nationalism. So in early April 1989, Georgian nationalists marched in from the House of Government in Tbilisi demanding independence. On April 9th, 21 Georgian protesters refused to leave and were killed by Soviet special forces in melee combat, the Soviet soldiers killing them largely with spades. Initial statements by Soviet authorities blamed the protesters, who did not disperse when told to by the authorities. And the Patriarch of Georgia warned them about what was going to happen and said that they ought to disperse because they were going to be forcibly dispersed for the protest. Some sources say that they attacked first, actually, against the police. They attacked them with stones, metal chains, rods, and other improvised melee weapons. Later, during the first Congress of People's Deputies in May to June 1989, Gorbachev then blamed the military for the action, throwing the military and other communists under the bus, when he could have easily argued that these protesters had attacked the military. He throws the military under the bus and alienates them. And he doesn't use that event as a way to spring forth the military and try and reclaim order. He throws the military trying to reclaim order under the bus. So fast forward to early January 1991. There's yet another example of Soviet troops massacring citizens protesting. In the early spring of 1990, Lithuania's local government had declared independence, and key buildings ended up being occupied by the Soviet military in order for them to truly enact any kind of real independence. And so the nation was put under internal blockade, and their local economy was destroyed as a way to peacefully punish them without killing people. So riots occurred in early January, and there were concerns that ethnic violence would erupt by Lithuanians against the ethnic Russian population in the country, which had settled more after the annexation of the country after World War II. And so Gorbachev ordered the military in to protect the ethnic Russians in Lithuania, and they occupy Vilnius and put down the disorder. And so when they put down this disorder in January 11th to 13th, 14 citizens or civilians end up being killed by the Soviet military. The Soviet Union was criticized for massacring these civilian protesters across the liberal world. And then as he was criticized for what he was doing, Gorbachev then pulled the military, or pushed the military under the bus again for following his own orders when they're trying to restore order in that country and trying to defend ethnic Russians against ethnic hostilities from Lithuanians, and that the integrity of the Soviet Union was being threatened. And so even outside of like a Machiavellian sense, he had every justification to prevent the country from falling apart. But what does he do? He demonizes the military and blames it for his own actions. Okay, this isn't going to surprise my followers, but I'm not a liberal, and I do not believe that people have an inherent absolute right to criticize and protest against the state no matter what. When protesters threaten the legitimacy of the state, and if the state has a choice between allowing those protesters the right to continue with their demonstrations and possibly overthrow it, and that would put the country into the state of the anarchy, the government, the state, has every right to self-defend themselves and restore order. The problem is that when killing protesting civilians, you're only vindicated in history if you win. If you lose in history, then you are going to become a villain, right? And so this is the problem with any kind of authoritarian clampdown. If you dare, you get vindicated by history. If you don't dare, then you are going to be villainized by history. So you're going to be a loser if you don't try. And if you try and you lose, you're going to be a loser. But Gorbachev, like, there's a situation here where he can either not try and be a loser. He can either try and put down people by force, put the country under martial law, and see where that goes. Try and save the country. Gorbachev goes for using the military to restore order, and then pulls back, doesn't take ownership, blames the military for what he ordered them to do, and then alienates the military. Not a good look. In 1989, nearly every communist country was on the verge of collapse. There was, of course, one country which faced large-scale protest and did not give in and did not shut them down with force, and that was the right decision for that state. That's the People's Republic of China, and that's the Tiananmen Square massacre. Other countries throughout history, I don't have to be pro-communist in saying this, but martial law can be justified. The Russian Empire saved itself through martial law. Communist Poland saved itself through martial law. South Korea saved itself through martial law. Turkey saved itself through martial law. Egypt saved itself through martial law. Pakistan saved itself through martial law. Chile saved itself through martial law. Using martial law as a way to stabilize your country, that's not just something that can be justified. It's something which ought to be done in certain circumstances. You need to do it. The benefits of it are justified. The reality is that civil war, anarchy, chaos, these are things that you don't want to wish upon your enemy. This is something you do not want to live through. Gorbachev had the responsibility as the leader of the country. He had the responsibility to defend the Soviet Union and to defend the populace from themselves. He could have saved the country. And you know what? The reality is that the collapse of the Soviet Union put on a tremendous hardship upon the people of that country. put a tremendous hardship on the Russians ethnically, put a tremendous hardship on Ukraine. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to multiple wars, including the Ukraine-Russian War. If Gorbachev had a backbone, he could have found a way out of this. He could have found a middle path, right? He didn't, though. He had no backbone, and he was a coward. And that is what is going to lead to the collapse of his country and the hardship for his people. By 1991, the Soviet Union was rapidly descending into chaos due to, and this is exemplified also by his limited use of martial law and pulling back from it. The Caucasus in particular was turning into this hotbed of violence. And the beginning stages of the Nagorno-Karabakh War and the South Ossetian War by this time were already happening. The Baltic states declared their independence outright, and their defiance was proven an example for all the other republics of the Soviet Union to leave the Confederation. The resistance and ethnic violence in these peripheral republics had the risk of spreading outwards to the core Slavic republics of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, just as the unrest from Eastern Europe to the Soviet Union proper was having. The nation was entering into this death spiral, and we know in retrospect it was going to collapse. Committing to martial law and emergency powers across the board could have saved it from this ultimate collapse. Gorbachev, though, did not do this, and he backed out in cowardice. Like with his halfway reforms between communism and liberalism, backing in and out and zigzagging with martial law from cowardice is going to make him into a villain. He's withholding martial law from the people that want it, the military. He's blocking them from doing it. He's blocking the hardliners from doing it. And he's the villain. He's the dictatorship to the reformers. He is no longer a reformer in their eyes. He's a dictatorship. He's a dictator, and he's a villain that has gloves on his hand. He's a weak coward, and he's a dictator that has blood on his hands. No win-win here for him. It should be said that at this point in 1991, if somebody supported the Soviet Union, that at this point meant keeping the country together. It didn't even mean communism anymore. As we know now, the outcome of the collapse of the Soviet Union would be the division of the 15 republics of the Confederation, and you would have all these spread out civil wars between them that have occurred since 1991. But there could have been an outcome in which the country transitioned out of communism and became a single entity, which would be more powerful than the Russian Federation, and which the Russian Federation, the ethnic Russians, would not have dropped in their birth rates. You know, Russians were at replacement level. Actually, the 1980s were a high period of regaining ethnic birth rates within Russia. So there is a reality where you have a kind of Russian Federation that continues to this day, that has something like a population of 350 or 400 million people, which is more powerful than the Russian Federation. It's at least a great power, if not a superpower anymore. And, you know, that's the reality. That's what could have happened. But the weakness here, that is, it rests on Gorbachev's shoulders. But there also could have been one very large civil war that left millions dead, a second Russian civil war, a greater Yugoslavia, a Yugoslavia with nukes. Now let's thank God that this didn't happen. So, in August of 1991, Gorbachev was driving the country towards what would have been called in retrospect the New Union Treaty, which was where he was going to have this new federal confederate constitution for the Soviet people, which would be drafted by the individual republics as equals. The previous Soviet constitution, as written, did not provide for a strong central government. It was the Communist Party as an organization which acted as the glue which held that country together. The treaty was set to diminish the already weak central power of the Soviet Union even more, though. Gorbachev was not going to get a strong central government in this treaty. The way it was looking was that it was going to weaken the center more and more and would lead to an ultimate disintegration of the country. Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they already said that they're not going to participate in this new treaty. And they had already declared independence by this point, at least on paper. To prevent this treaty, which was the road to nowhere, Gorbachev's own appointed underlings launched the August coup to prevent this likely dissolution of the central government. The coup happened on August 18th, 1991. The coup was led by a Gang of Eight, filled by Gorbachev's own appointees. You have his own vice president, Gendry Yandiev, an office that he created. The vice presidency, remember, with his own radical reforms a year prior. The coup, as far as we can tell, was designed to be an auto coup, which placed Gorbachev in power, but ironically without his own consent. The Gang of Eight's plan was to enact martial law through this coup, and then offer the country in a state of martial law in the hopes of to Gorbachev himself, in the hopes that he would understand at that point the direness of the situation, and that he would use the dictatorship to form a new constitution, which wasn't necessarily communist, I should say, but would have a strong central government. And that way they could save the country. Gorbachev at that point was in his summer retreat on the Black Sea when this occurred, and he was offered to lead the country in this strange plan, which he did not devise. This plan was, of course, idiotic. They should have just killed Gorbachev and installed themselves as leaders. Because why would Gorbachev trust it? He naturally had good enough instincts not to trust it, and he rejected the offer, which put the coup into this kind of prolonged limbo where they didn't know what to do. And Yandiev, because they're in this prolonged limbo where they don't know what to do, they don't have the resolve or courage to kill or even exile Gorbachev and take formal control of the country themselves. And ultimately, because of this lack of an action in this very volatile situation, the coup dissolved and it ended. During the course of this brief coup, critically, Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, and now the arch anti-communist and personal nemesis of Gorbachev, he wasn't arrested and he wasn't detained by the conspirators. And so Yeltsin became the Hegelian world spirit. He rushed to the White House, which is the seat of the Russian Republican government at that time, and he began to protest the coup and the presumed dictatorship that was there to save the Soviet Union. The military then surrounded Yeltsin and the other protesters that were with them, but because of their lack of agency and their lack of resolve, they didn't arrest him and they didn't kill him. And so the whole Russian populace at this time rallies behind Yeltsin as he becomes the world spirit, the wrecking ball that will destroy the Soviet Union. And he's able, through this, to gain legitimacy and become the paramount ruler of the Soviet Union over and against Gorbachev. On August 21st, Yandiev met with Gorbachev, the vice president, offered him the status of this martial law pretty directly, and then Gorbachev rejects it. Gang of Eight concedes. They get on the airplane to go back to Moscow. Gorbachev labeled them as traitors, and they return to Moscow, and they go up to the legislature. Gorbachev's rejection of the coup did not result in him being seen as the savior for democracy, liberalism, or the reform away from communism. Instead, Yeltsin took on that mantle, and now Yeltsin, despite Gorbachev resisting the coup, was the champion of the reform. He was the focal point, the pivot point, the paramount leader. Yeltsin and Gorbachev then addressed the legislature on national television together, and Yeltsin publicly humiliates Gorbachev and demands to his face that the Communist Party be banned. Gorbachev then gives in to Yeltsin's demands and resigns as leader and bans the Communist Party. Ukraine then declares its own unilateral declaration of independence on August 24th, meaning that there's no core republics, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, the core Slavic republics, to stand together. And it's not a peripheral country anymore, a small Caucasus country or the Baltic states. It's the real true core of the Soviet Union, which is pushing back against the middle, Ukraine. After this coup, Yeltsin had basically gained the mandate from heaven, and he was a paramount and de facto ruler of the Soviet Union in these final stages. With the Communist Party banned, the Soviet Union was now nothing more than a loose confederation between 15 separate nations. Without the Communist Party, Gorbachev only had ceremonial power now. Yeltsin, as the head of the Russian Republic, was able to take control of funding of the central government and shifted the tax revenue and funding he received from the Russian Republic away from the Soviet central government and starved it and starved Gorbachev out and basically made Gorbachev unable to do anything. And he just had an empty building which was completely subservient to any tax funds from Yeltsin himself. Gorbachev, without any real options left, and with the Ukrainian Republic not wanting to be part of the Soviet Union anymore, he only had one course of action, and that was to try and use the already previously scheduled meeting for this new Union Treaty in his favor and try and make this weird backroom deal with the Central Asian republics and make them the center of the Soviet Union over and against Yeltsin's Russia. And Yeltsin saw this new constitution, and he really knew what he had to do. Yeltsin hated Gorbachev and didn't want to be any kind of second banana in this new republic. The Central Asian states and Belarus were landlocked, and they're completely independent on Russia. And so he's not going to give in to Gorbachev making him some kind of second banana when Russia is supposed to be the Soviet Union. Russia is the center of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is supposed to serve Russia. He's not going to sit by and have, Belarus and Kazakhstan call the shots over Russia. And Yeltsin doesn't want to have any kind of country where Gorbachev is making this agreement where Ukraine can leave and then Central Asia are going to stay in as, kind of these countries which are going to suck off welfare from Russia as they had before without a Slavic majority. Because if Ukraine leaves, then ethnic Slavs could end up only being a plurality of the country. Without Ukraine, then the Soviet Union isn't a supermajority, it's just a slight majority Slavic. And it would completely lose its kind of Russo-centric identity. Even if it's an affirmative action empire and everything, it's still this Russian speaking bloc. And this new Union Treaty that Gorbachev's going to have, this deal with Central Asia that's going to drag in Russia with the Soviet Union, that's going to change the trajectory of what the Soviet Union is. It's going to be half Central Asian and it's going to be half Russian, as opposed to majority Slavic, with Central Asia and the Baltic states and the Caucasus as these minorities. So Yeltsin knew what he had to do something, and so his solution was brilliant. He preempted Gorbachev's meeting with a meeting of his own, where he formed his own new union. What he does is that he calls the three members of the Slavic republics together secretly, the three Slavic republics being Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, of course, and they meet together and all unilaterally declare independence from the Soviet Union and set the Soviet Union on the course to dissolving. This meeting became known as the Belaslava Accords or the Minsk Agreement. It happened on December 8th, 1991. The three of them kept this a secret from Gorbachev and the public at large, since technically speaking it was treason. And what they did just dissolved the Soviet Union. And so they were under this fear that somehow, even if Gorbachev had no power and was ceremonial, that somehow he'd be able to order the military to stop them or something like that. So that's why they met up in secret. And so Gorbachev still is able to go on with this new Union Treaty, but what's going to result from this Union Treaty is the Commonwealth of States, this loose intergovernmental agency which facilitates trade between the post-Soviet republics. And so even though from the 8th on the country is basically dissolved in all but name, Gorbachev's going to try and maintain his office for a little bit longer. And he finally resigns on December 26, 1991. And that's what marks the end of the Soviet Union in the official history, is his final resignation. And that's where you get the change of the flags over the Kremlin from the Soviet flag, this is such a famous image, to the Russian flag. And the Soviet Union's over. Soviet Union ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Or at least a low whimper and, a lot of smaller bangs. Not a giant bang, but a lot of smaller bangs with the regional wars. There wasn't, thank God, because there wasn't going to be this general civil war to maintain it. And, World War III, the NATO Warsaw Pact war never ended either. While there were external pressures on the Soviet Union and its economic system, kind of was chained in with this ideology. Neither of these things, though, I think were what ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think they're kind of tertiary problems that contributed to the collapse or made the situation worse. I think that the primary reason for the collapse was self-inflicted wounds due to incompetence from its leadership. The weak leadership, which is exemplified by Mikhail Gorbachev, is a shit man of history, whose tenure as the General Secretary of the Communist Party and then President of the Soviet Union was marked without any kind of cautiousness or pragmatism. Instead, it was an all-out liberal ideological suicide move. The Soviet Union certainly needed reforms. Gorbachev was incredibly aggressive and radical in the ways that he did them. He never stopped pushing them forwards. He never stopped to breathe and stabilize without going towards another reform. He never backtracked on them either. To make matters worse, many of these reforms, they're very hastily done and without any true understanding of economics or the world stage or just the Soviets' own internal system. Rapidity of these reforms then happened in such a quick succession that their shortcomings kept feeding into each other and led into the spiraling collapse of which Gorbachev and the underlings that he picked were really too cowardly to stop until it was far, far too late. And the underlings, even they, in that coup, knew that they had to do something. But even at that point, Gorbachev, he still was too cowardly to do what needed to be done. And so the result is that the Soviet Union collapsed. Thank God there was no World War III, and thank God there was no Yugoslavia with nukes. But the Soviet Union could have transitioned out of communism. Soviet Union could have transitioned into some kind of softer form of communism with a human face. The borders of the Soviet Union could have been maintained, and that there wouldn't have been all these terrible wars. The standard of living brought on by the collapse and the complete economic incompetence of the reformers, especially in Russia and Ukraine, that the standard of living wouldn't have fallen out. The Russians and Ukrainians and Belarusians they wouldn't have the sustained drop in their fertility. All these things could have been avoided had they had a better leader, but unfortunately they didn't. They were stuck with the shit man of history, Mikhail Gorbachev.